Sometimes when it comes to statins, it's helpful to take a step back and take what my bosses at work used to call the 30,000 foot view to really see what's going on. Today we're going to talk about 3 things about the statin environment, I guess we'd call it, that are really elephants in the room that nobody's talking about. Stay tuned. The first elephant I want to talk about has to do with statistics and studies. Statistics are contradictory, they're hard to apply, and they depend heavily on extrapolations. What I mean by that is whenever we see a study for statin effectiveness, we've got to take it with a grain of salt basically because they all contradict each other. Extrapolating data from a study and applying it to a different situation really is not always all that accurate. In some cases it's invalid. For example, we may extrapolate data over time. So if some data applies to a 4-year study, we extrapolate it to an 8-year study and think that it applies necessarily to that longer time period. We may apply it to different risk levels. And I'm going to get into that because I do that a lot and I kind of use it just as a start of conversation, but I've really got to admit that it's not always valid when I do those extrapolations. And then we may apply it to a different group. For example, if we have a group of elderly women and we do a study on them, that doesn't necessarily apply to teenage boys. Those are the sorts of extrapolations we've got to be very careful about. And here's an example, and this is one that I've fallen into. The absolute risk reduction that you get from taking statins, I have always based on the famous Lipitor ad here that says that it reduces heart attacks by 36% relative risk reduction. And they give the example here that in a study, 3% of the people in the control group had heart attacks and a little bit less than 2% of the people in the treated group had heart attacks. So the relative risk reduction was 36% because the 1.1% difference there is 36% of 3%. And if we were to extrapolate that and say, like we show in this graph here, that's for a 3% risk of a cardiovascular event, they get an absolute risk reduction of about 1.1%. We project that and say, in the extreme case, if there was a 100% chance of a cardiovascular event by somebody over whatever time period, 36% of those people in that group would be saved, so to speak, by a statin. That's not necessarily true. This extrapolation is based on that red dot on this chart. To extend that all the way across all risk levels is really not warranted. I admit that I've been doing that. I use it for a lot of arguments, but I usually caveat it and say, and for the sake of argument, let's just accept this as a starting point. But it's not necessarily really like that. For example, recently, when I was doing some research, I found a study of 28,000 people. I mentioned it in my last video. About 2/3 of them had continued to take statins and about 1/3 of them had gotten off statins. The group that had gotten off statins had more cardiovascular events than the group who stayed on them, but not by much. In over 4 years, it was 0.9% difference between the two. And these were patients who were taking statins for secondary prevention and had a 10-year risk of approximately 20%. Their relative risk reduction was about 11%. Not 36%. So we can see that the higher the risk, it's possible that the relative risk reduction that statins provide goes down as risk goes up. And that means who knows what happens to the absolute risk reduction in that case. This chart here I have on the right, it's just an example of what it could be. I can even imagine that as your risk of getting a heart attack approaches 100%, in other words, you're definitely going to have a heart attack, it's quite possible that you're too far gone. Statins won't help you at all. The graph on the left is what I've been kind of assuming just for the sake of argument. Graph on the right may be the correct one. The problem is we don't know. There is no way of knowing how the relative risk reduction applies across all risk levels. There's just no way to design clinical trials that can answer this question. Another few questions that we can't get out of the statistics are what percentage of people taking statins in the US, for example, had heart attacks? What percent of people who had heart attacks were on statins? That's actually a different question than the first one, even though they sound similar. They are very different questions. What percentage of people taking statins? That's one group. And then out of everybody who has a heart attack, how many of them were on statins? And if you think about that, you'll see they're actually different questions. So that's elephant number one. The statistics and the studies are being applied far too widely. They have very, very limited application to what we really want to know. Elephant in the room number two, I have actually spoken about this before, and that is the number of patients who are on statins. In the United States, as of 2019, 92 million people were on statins. That's about a third of all U.S. adults. And there were 800,000 heart attacks per year in the U.S. A lot of those heart attacks, I don't know how many, are from among people who are already taking statins. The problem here is the shotgun approach to the prescribing of statins is just giving it to everybody you can so that you can pick up some benefit for some people. I brought this up in some of my earliest videos that it would really be nice if we could laser focus onto the patients who are actually going to benefit from statins. Out of this 92 million people, maybe we could do a better job of identifying who are the 800,000 or who are the 8 million over the next 10 years, if that's the time frame that we're talking about, and focus in and try treating them rather than having, I mean, it's probably up to 100 million people in the United States now because this data is 5 years old. So why give this to 92 million people who don't need it? Give it to the 8 million people who might benefit from it. And among those, probably 2/3 of them are still going to have their event anyway. That's a whole nother story. We're constantly told by the medical profession that more patients need to be on statins. That's going back to that shotgun approach. So that's the elephant in the room. The approach by the medical profession is give these things to more and more people when we don't even know how good, by elephant number one, how much good they're doing us. Research will never be done, however, to identify who really benefits. Because if you think about it, when the statins were under patents, they were cash cows. The pharmaceutical company has an obligation to its stockholders to be profitable. Why would they do any research, spend money on research that's going to reduce the amount of statins that they sell? That's just never going to happen. It's outside the paradigm of the pharmaceutical industry right now. And even after the patents have expired, there's no reasonable source to fund such research. The companies that are making the generic statins, it's like making widgets. They're just, let's sell as many as we can. We're never going to have the proper research that tells us what we really need to know, and that is who of the population is really going to benefit from statins. All we get is this statistical noise that says there's a relative risk reduction in this small group of this much, and who knows what it is in some other group. Elephant number 3 in the room, and this is a big one. Patients are just rejecting statins. Not all of them, of course. A lot of patients are still taking their statins and are very happy with it, but a lot of patients are rejecting them. I went onto Google and I typed in how many people stopped taking statins. First thing that came up was the University of Washington report that said 10% of all patients. NBC News said it was 28%. The Mayo Clinic says nearly 30%, so that's kind of consistent with the NBC News. The AARP magazine from last year said that 50% of patients stop within 1 year. The elephant in the room, so to speak, is how the mainstream medical profession addresses this issue. So I'm going to tell a little story. This is a true story, nothing to do with statins. It just comes from the corporate world in the United States. So if you've ever worked in corporate America, or probably this is true in a lot of different countries, that sometimes it seems that the corporations just, I don't know how to put this politely, but they've got their heads where the sun doesn't shine. We would have what would be called skip level meetings, which meant the little people such as myself. I was an individual contributor or a frontline manager at most, so I was pretty low on the corporate totem pole. I was never an executive or anything like that. We'd actually be able to sit down with the big boys. It was called a skip level meeting because we were skipping our own bosses and going to a level higher, and we were going to express our concerns and that sort of thing. Well, one time the business unit executives sent their HR specialist down to talk to us to see why people were generally unhappy with the way things were going. And we openly and honestly told this executive what the problem was. Our naive expectation was they would take this information and then they would go maybe incorporate some changes. We weren't naive enough to think that they would change everything, but we thought they would go back to headquarters and figure out some ways of making things better. But what they really did with this information is they used it in order to develop a targeted campaign towards educating us about why these things really weren't problems, or why we should accept them the way they were and continue with business as usual. There was no intent ever to make things better. There was simply an intent to convince us that things were actually fine. So returning to the subject of statins, when patients reject statins and say, no, we don't want to take these things, the mainstream medical profession's response to that is we've got to persuade the patients that it's in their best interest to take these medications, rather than taking a step back and looking and say, what is it about these medications that just isn't good enough? Is it the 11% relative risk reduction or the 1% absolute risk reduction or whatever it is? Is it all the adverse effects? They come out and they tell us there aren't any adverse effects. Here is one article I found where they were actually pretty honest about this part of it. A doctor was being interviewed and he said, we thought there was a 1% chance of having muscle aches as a side effect. And that's what came out of the randomized clinical trials. The randomized clinical trials, however, were not designed to pick up adverse effects. They were designed to try showing effectiveness. And what they quite often do in those is they have a run-in period, and a lot of people who are going to participate in the clinical trial have an opportunity to take the medication for some amount of time, say 5 weeks, and if they find that it's just too many adverse effects or for whatever reason, they can drop out of the trial. So these 1% chance of having muscle aches was among people who didn't have muscle aches in the first 5 weeks, so of course it wasn't going to pick up all the adverse effects. So they went on to say when it's really 15 to 20%, so patients lost trust with us. That is a good acknowledgement of really what happened. What became of this? Really nothing, because what does the mainstream medical profession do? They keep on pushing statins and trying to convince us that it's either nocebo effect, it's all in our heads, or you can tolerate that, the benefits outweigh the risks. We hear those statements all the time. Another one from the same article, almost 2/3 of Americans who would benefit from statins aren't taking them. I look at that and I say, well, we're giving them to about 1/3 of all American adults. So are they implying that every adult will benefit from being on statins, but they're not taking them, so we need to triple the amount of statin prescriptions? Or is it that we're giving it to the wrong people and the people who really need them aren't on them? Who knows what they mean, but that's an example of the attitude that we get from mainstream medical profession, and that is the problem isn't the medication, the problem is the patients. And I think that's the real problem. That is the big elephant here. Patients are rejecting it, and the mainstream medical profession is saying the problem lies with the patients. The problem doesn't lie with the medication, and that's got it exactly backwards. So my closing thoughts on this. There are a lot of problems with statins that simply go unacknowledged. They're the elephants in the room. If you aren't a native English speaker, maybe you don't know the metaphor there, but it's when there's something large in the room and everybody's pretending it's not there or talking around it and not just saying, why is there this elephant in the room? Or in our case, why is it that we're giving statins to 92 million people in the United States when only a small percentage are going to benefit from it? Why are people rejecting statins and saying, I don't want to take them, or I don't want to take them anymore if I've been on them? Why are the reports of adverse effects much higher than what we think they were from randomized controlled trials that weren't even designed to find those? And hiding behind things like the nocebo effect just shows that when it comes to statins, the mainstream medical community has missed the point. So that's what I have on this topic. If you appreciate this content, please like, share, subscribe, and comment on this topic or others you'd like me to cover. And if you haven't seen this video, I recommend you take a look at it now. Thanks for listening.